Welcome to Reputation Revolution. This is the podcast where we help individuals like you to establish your voice in the marketplace, enhance the credibility of that voice, extend the reach of your story and your message, and finally, extract value from your efforts in building a meaningful personal brand that's both recognized and respected. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Trevor back with another episode of the Reputation Revolution show, and today I have a ripper conversation for you. It's one person's personal brand journey and how they've managed to successfully package, communicate and capitalize on the personal brand they've built in the marketplace. Now, as many listeners will know, this podcast is geared around plotting our own personal brand journey and the four cornerstones of becoming what I call a credible authority in the marketplace. That is, number one, empower your voice. Number two, enhance the credibility of that voice. Number three, extend the reach of your voice. And number four, extract the value from the profile and the professional reputation you build. Long-time listeners will know that this covers myriad things. We're talking content and becoming your own media channel, social media, generating editorial exposure in third-party media outlets, book publishing, speaking from the stage, but also mindset and overcoming limiting beliefs, and plus the commercialization of your brand. So all of that. And so my guest today has done just that, and he's here to tell us about it. His name is Oscar Trimboli. He's an author, host of the podcast Deep Listening, and a sought-after keynote speaker. He is passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in homes, workplaces, and cultures around the world. Oscar, welcome to the show.
G'day, Trevor. Looking forward to listening to your questions.
Oh, it's mate. There's a lot we want to cover, and I want to. It'll probably be less question and answer today, a bit more on the your story and how it's stacked up. Because, as I said at the outset, you've done a lot of these things. So you've built your brand, you've done the content, you've done the social, you're commercializing it, all of that. So can we unpack that, if we may? But a quick thumbnail sketch of yourself. I said at the outset, you are the guru of listening. So you've managed to, make listening your thing, become an expert for it. Tell us about that.
In 2008, I was in a boardroom meeting with 18 people, and Sydney, Singapore, and Seattle, when we were setting the budget for the year. It was a 90-minute meeting, and it was pretty important. If you don't get the budget right, people lose their jobs. So for me, it's a pretty high responsibility. But at the 20-minute mark, my vice president looked me across the boardroom table and said, "Oscar, I need to see you immediately after this meeting." And the only thing that was going through my head, Trevor, is how many weeks of salary have I got left in my bank account? Because Tracy's never said that to me before. The meeting finished early, actually, finished at the 70-minute mark, and Tracy asked me to close the door. And as I walked back towards my seat, she said, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And all I thought was, great. I'm getting fired and I have no idea what I did. And as I sat down, she said, "If you could code the way you listen, Oscar, you could change the world, because the meeting moved at the 20-minute mark when you asked that question." Now, Trevor, the only thing going through my head at the moment was not Tracy said something really profound that'll change the course of my life. It's like, woohoo, I haven't been fired. And, putting all the money that I'd taken out of my bank account, or imaginary in that case, and stuffing it all the way back in. And I walked out of that room because I'd got a 32% increase in my budget. I was a marketing director of Microsoft at the time, and that was my revenue line, which was fairly steep. And a week later, the CFO said to me, "Hey, Oscar, can you come and audit my listening?" Because he was doing the next budget meeting for Australia. I said, "Brian, I haven't..."
Audit your listening.
Yeah, and I said, "Brian, I haven't got any time for this listening caper. You and Tracy have obviously been talking. I got a 32% increase in my revenue line." And Brian said, "Look, I can't change your revenue line, but if you come and audit my listening, I'll see what I can do around investing for the growth areas of your business." And I was very commercial. I thought, if that's what you want, Brian, I'll sit down and audit your listening. And as I sat down, I audited Brian's listening. I noticed, gee, he asked a lot of really long, convoluted questions. There's 19 people in the room, but he's only really talking to 3 people. Gee, he cuts them off pretty quickly. I'm not sure that was a question. It was probably a statement. And in that moment, I started coding listening. Wind the clock forward to today. We've got a range of expressions of coding. We've got a listening quiz that people can take on the website. We've got a podcast. We've got a jigsaw puzzle game. We've got a couple of books. We've got a set of playing cards that people can practice with. And that's where I am today, a decade later.
I was going to ask how long was that gestation period, but a decade. So when you started off, like seriously, there wouldn't have been too many listening experts out there or publicly pushing that line, were there? Was it a kind of a territory you had to carve out and then educate a business audience on?
There was one clear global leader in the space, Julian Treasure, who'd done a couple of TED Talks. He's English, and his background is in music, and he runs an organisation called Sound Agency. And his take on listening was more around the acoustics of listening, and he'd commercialised that through creating soundscapes in retail experiences for customers and big brands. And for me, what I'd realised is there's a lot of wasted time, wasted money, wasted resources when people don't listen to each other, whether that's in budget setting meetings, sales processes, annual performance reviews, or simply the act of market research where people research the customer every year but never actually do anything with the research that they have in place. Look, Trevor, for the first 2 years, the content I was creating was absolute rubbish. It was focusing on the positive aspects of listening, and it wasn't getting any traction at all because I wasn't talking to their problem. I was talking to my hypothetical solution. I had the opportunity to read a book called Scared, Stupid and Simple by Kieran Flanagan and Dan Gregory, which talked about people relate to negative consequences much quicker. And as a result of that, I started creating content that talked to the challenges people face when listening, the barriers that get in the way of people listening. And these became the 4 personas that we did 2.5 years of independent market research, where we researched 1,410 people in the workplace and defined 4 personas, the 4 villains of listening. And as a result of that, the quiz came to being because we created the quiz off the back of the research. And in the back of my mind, Trevor, I really wasn't doing a great job of listening because many of my clients had asked me for some kind of assessment tool, but I just didn't know how to go about doing it. So I was lucky enough to meet Heidi Martin from Audience Insights, who's a really pragmatic market researcher, and she showed me how to create these 4 personas out of the research that we did, which was about 5.5 years ago now.
So they walk us through then, once you sort of worked out that, you know, you're educating people on the positives, but then it's the negatives that drew people to your content. When did you start blogging? How long has the podcast been going for? You know, what did your owned media channels look like, and what sort of role did they play in, I guess, sparking conversation around a topic that's kind of people understand listening, but they don't really understand listening and at the depth that you do?
I think the big insights for me was that you can tell people they can be an Olympic athlete, but that really appeals to 0.05% of the community. And that's where my initial blogging posting was from. What do world-class listeners do? What does world-class listening look and feel like? But most people are stuck on the couch. They're not ready to be an Olympic athlete. And what I had to do was create content that met them where they're at and break it down as simply as possible and express that in multiple ways. I never forget Dermot, a friend of mine, saying to me, in a beautiful Irish accent, and I'm not going to do it any credit, so I won't try and do it. He goes, Oscar, you're an absolute idiot. Why are you only doing a newsletter? If your topic is listening, why wouldn't you do a podcast? Now, this is a great moment of insight, and it's also important to understand when well-meaning advice isn't right for you in that moment, and why you need somebody like you, Trevor, to guide people. Because the biggest mistake I did was I started a podcast, and if I had my time all over again, I would do 150 podcast interviews on somebody else's podcast before I create my own. Because subsequently, I've done well over 300 podcast interviews, and that's where I found my voice. That's where I found the stories that stuck. And although we've won an Apple Award for our podcast in 2018, because the podcast was really, really different, not just the topic, but the format, creating a podcast is a lot of work. It's a really powerful, powerful tool to keep the people who know you engaged. I think that's the purpose of the podcast that you create. It's a podcast to create engagement with people who already know you, but get on other people's podcasts to spread your message to people who don't know you. And I almost want to apologize for my first couple of podcasts, but I don't, because we've all got to start somewhere. So
You've got to start. You've got to start. I think anyone who's podcasted, done YouTube videos, newsletters, blogs, you go back to, you look at your early stuff and you think, oh my Lord.
But that's okay. That's where you're at the time, and the more you practice, we just clicked over 100 episodes on the podcast, and we continuously adjust by asking the audience what do they want to improve on. And every time I exited a podcast interview, I'd ask the host, if I had time, I'd ask them 3 questions. The first one is, if we had our time all over again, what would make it more impactful for your audience? And if they had a little bit more time, I'd ask them the story that stuck and the one thing they do differently as a result of the conversation. And by asking these questions and listening to the hosts, all of a sudden you're going to figure out where the stories are that are really powerful and useful, and more importantly, the stories that aren't.
So when you said the 100, that's 100 as a guest on other people's podcasts?
100 of the deep listening podcasts that I create. Yeah. We're I think I'm just short of 300 on other people's podcasts.
Oh, so that was, I was trying to work out the two. So 300 on other people's and 100 of your own.
Yep.
Fantastic. I think I love the 1-2 punch of that. I think the being the podcaster and being on other people's podcasts, very, very, very powerful. And of course, there's a lot of fantastic podcasts out there, and it's, some are small, some are large, and some are huge. And, it's some of the smaller ones that have got more engagement at a niche level can be really powerful, because it allows you to get deep into a topic, and that's great for the listener. A couple of things there then. So you were were you blogging or just went straight to newsletter? Because of course newsletters now are the big thing, and you were maybe an early mover in that space. How long into the journey did you start the writing, even though you felt that after a period of time it wasn't working for you?
Day one. So but that was through other people's platforms. That was pretty much all on LinkedIn, and I made sure that I was fairly consistent. During my time at Microsoft, I'd developed quite a substantial following from people, but unfortunately not on the topic that I was going to move to. So a lot, all that audience that had built up, I probably lost 2/3 of it, because I said, okay, this is what I'm doing going forward, and you could see the drop off there, which is fine. That's no problem. So I think I just got into a very simple routine of trying to get 300 words out a week, and my writing voice improved just through continuing the practice.
Just through doing it. So that was 10 years. That was kind of 10 years ago when you've started. And how many years so you were writing mainly for LinkedIn?
Yep.
How many, none on your own blog, and when did the newsletter come in? Or did you have a blog percolating in the background?
Yeah, I definitely don't have a blog percolating in the background. I've got the newsletter content that I send out, which is either connected to the podcast series that we want to keep people up to date on,
Yep.
or what content that we send through the two channels. I haven't got the bandwidth to be on multiple channels. So for me, all my focus and all my effort and all the people I help are all on LinkedIn. So that's my primary focus there. I know there are people who can juggle multiple platforms, but for me, the quiz is driving about 200 new subscribers to the newsletter each week, and that's not how it started, but that's where it's at now. And the thing is that I've learned that 200 per week sounds impressive, but how many can you keep and engage? That's the real value that you can provide for those audiences there. So it's kind of a...
Do you know how long how big your list is now, or you just don't bother checking in on that all the time?
Oh, no, I think we've had nearly just gone past 18,000 people completing the quiz. But the number of people who regularly open the newsletter is about half of that. So it's, from that point of view, it's somebody who's curious enough to do a quiz may be instructed to do that by the organisation I'm working with, or they just might find it through some kind of search that they're trying to improve at any particular point in time.
So can I just sort of back the truck up there for a tick? So just so people are listening along at home or wherever, probably walking, maybe at the gym. But so when you started, you did LinkedIn, you were writing, you found your voice, you continue to write on LinkedIn, you build LinkedIn, that just continues. You are on Twitter, but clearly that's your 1-2 punch, but your key one channel continues to be LinkedIn. You didn't have a blog, but you did have a newsletter, and the newsletter now is correlated with or in alignment with the podcast. Yeah. So you have, it's kind of like you got a 1 and a 2 punch on. That's just my language, but so you got the LinkedIn is your main one with Twitter as a subset. You've got the podcast is your main owned media channel with the newsletter as the support owned media channel there as well, and with the newsletter, you've got 18,000 subs, but you've incentivized people to join your list through the quiz that you were talking about. So giving something a bit of value for a fair value exchange. And of those people that sign up, you're getting something like a 50% open rate on your newsletter, which is huge. That's huge. So you've got a very strong, engaged audience, and they're the key elements. And what is it in terms of now? It's just a matter of staying fresh with your content. Like you've been doing it for a while. How do you find that podcasting helps you keep fresh because you always new views and new points of perspectives coming through that? How do you keep going on stuff like that? Keep being fresh.
So one of the things we do whenever we run a webinar series every single month. It's completely free. It's called the Deep Listening Ambassadors Community. And the Deep Listening Ambassadors Community, we run one theme every month on a narrow perspective around listening. And whether it's there or the public or private workshops that I run, we always ask one question if we can, or 3. But the one question we always ask is, what gets in the way of your listening in the workplace? Now, I've got over 1,000 of those questions now, Trevor, and about 4 months ago, I should probably put those into a spreadsheet and put them into themes and start a conversation around that. So historically with the Deep Listening podcast, it was monthly. It was interview-based, where we interviewed a workplace listening professional, an air traffic controller, a judge, somebody where listening is a pretty important part of what they do. But what we got feedback from the audience is, Oscar, we love your interview style, but can we hear more from you? And I was like, yeah, what am I going to say? So these 1,000 questions have now been boiled down into about 20 themes. And that connects to the theme of our monthly webinar. So, for example, in this month, our monthly webinar is how do you listen on a video conference as a host? So a lot of people go very specific or very generic. I'm very specific when I create that content. And now we have a series of 5 to 7 minute episodes in between the interview formats where we just talk to those questions. So I think the last one we did is how do you listen for moving the group from a debate to a decision? And that's a common question I get asked by a lot of leaders. When do you stop listening, Oscar? When does too much listening become unproductive, as an example? The other thing is we've created a working document, a PDF called, how to listen, the ultimate guide to listening in a video conference. That's about 55 pages long for the host, and it gives them a series of before, during, and after things to do. Not a technical guide to the video conference platform, but how do you listen in a really effective way on video conference? So I've gone much narrower in the content. Historically, I was probably very broad, where I talked to my model, which is the 5 levels of listening, but in driving the content, and I'm really happy with it. It gets many, many, many fewer views, but the views it gets on LinkedIn is much more engaged, where people go, wow, that I can take that tip away. I'm going to use that tip, thanks. And they're sharing it as well.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one thing you said there, Oscar, and I love it. You've asked questions of your audience, basically, of what people want. You got 1,000 kind of questions, and no doubt there are, of those, there would be some very frequently asked questions, but you're putting that content, you're turning those questions and that feedback back into themes and content for your webinars and for those mini podcast episodes as well. I love that. I think that's, and no doubt LinkedIn as well. So that knock-on effect is very powerful. There's a great lesson there for anyone listening who wants to be very strategic and mindful about the content that they do create. So the webinar, is that's kind of goes out to your list, and that's on a month by month. Do you get good take up of webinars?
Look, I think compared to pandemic timeframes where people go, I'm constrained, that's good content, I'll come and do it. I think as people have come out of various forms of lockdowns around the world, that's definitely dropped off. But again, I'm very happy doing a webinar to 10 people that are very engaged, because they bring somebody next month, or they bring somebody the month after. That creates its own word of mouth through that community. So for me, often the raw numbers, I think it's a head fake sometimes. Are you getting the right people? Are those people speaking highly of the value that you're creating? I think that matters more to me. In the early days, I was obsessed. The bigger the number, the better, and I was completely wrong, Trevor. It's am I having the right kinds of conversations with the right kinds of people? And the group itself gave itself its name. Like I even asked the group, what do you want to call yourselves? And that kind of deep listening ambassador sub-brand kind of emerged from that. And longer term, I sense that those people want to figure out maybe how to license or put that into their workplace with them hosting the content and me training them somehow. I have no idea. It all feels a bit vague and opaque right now, but I think that's something that may emerge out of that as well.
How many have you done? How many webinars like that?
Oh, we've been doing those webinars since probably 5 years every month. So we skip December and January, so 10 months of these, so 50 so far.
Wow, that's you would have been doing webinars well before most people. So as the technology, if you've seen an improvement in the technology over that 5 years of doing it?
Trevor, I was selling video conferencing software in 1993. So I've kind of trained it, hosted it, marketed it. I've seen the evolution in technology for video conferences over many decades. And I think today it's simple to access. Bandwidth is the most important thing. You can have great video resolution, but if the bandwidth isn't there, but just being able to put the ambassador community together in a breakout room and go, hey, go and have a chat for 5 minutes. And we run our webinars on 3 time zones on the same day. So a very early start and a very late finish for me. But if for me, what people say to me about the ambassadors community is, wow, I get to meet somebody in a different industry, in a different continent, a different culture, different context. And for me, it's the connections across the community are more important for me than the connections with me in that community. So that's the big...
So on that day, you do 3?
Yeah. So
you do 3.
5:30 a.m. is the first one, and the last one is at 8:30 p.m. And we have one in the lunchtime as well.
Yeah. So clearly, your audience is you wouldn't be doing that just for local. You're in Australia. You have for a local audience. So audience is global, spread out.
Yeah, nearly 50% of my database is from North America, Canada, and the United States, and that was the reason that the book we're just about to launch will be launched there first. It'll be launched through a North American publisher, and but I think that's the good thing about the database and the newsletter. You can ask people for information about their location in a way podcasting can't, for example. And that way you understand simple things like, okay, for the time zones and the kinds of audiences that we're likely to get, we can have a good educated guess about that in advance too.
So you mentioned you got a new book coming out. You've got another book as well. How many books have you got?
So book number 1's called Breakthroughs, How to Confront Your Assumption. Book 2, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. And book 3, we've made it really, really simple. The title is How to Listen. So that's coming out. Well, it's available for order now, but it'll be coming out in the next couple of months. And we'll be...
Good timing for this.
Yeah, and we'll be doing simultaneous audio as well as physical and ebook launch. I got a lot of pressure from the Deep Listening ambassadors who were deeply involved in the design. It's like, okay, Oscar, if it's going to be about listening, I don't want to wait for the audio 3 months later. Get it ready now. So I'm in the middle of recording for that as we speak and learning which mornings I'm nasally versus the mornings I'm not. And my poor audiobook producer in Atlanta is very confused. He hasn't been able to pattern match, but we're recording like every other day instead of 2 to 3 days in a row, which is a bit weird. But we want to create a great listening experience for the audience.
Of course. And your previous book, that was probably the main one, wasn't it? Deep Listening, or?
Oh yeah, it's like it's the most current book. It's the one that everybody references, and the one that got a lot of pressure for me to also people were asked to create playing cards. Simple. It's 50 questions you can ask in any particular kind of listening scenario as well. So for me, what's been fascinating about writing the book and having people talk about the book, and I get photos from people. I remember I got one from somebody backpacking through the mountains in Jordan, of all places, and just said, I'm in the middle of this gorgeous valley in the middle of the mountains, and this is the perfect place to read your book, Oscar. And it's like, oh wow. You have a completely different connection with the audience when the book's there. But I think also when you reach out to podcast hosts around the world, it's very different. As they said, a lot of podcast hosts use a primary screening preference of if someone's written a book or not. That will be a primary screen for them taking the person on to the podcast, because if you've taken the time to write a book, you'll be able to coherently and sequentially express the idea rather than a bunch of random stories.
Yeah. Have you had a publisher for the whole way, all the books?
No, the first two were self-published. The third one was a funny story. The current one, a story about listening in the middle of the pandemic. A publisher reached out to me and said, I can see this huge series of how to listen here, here, and here. So like how to listen for lawyers, how to listen for accountants, etc.
Yeah.
And I said, great, but half my audience is in North America. How does this work? And they said, well, publish the book in Australia, and then 2 to 3 years later, we'll do it in the US. And I go, look, I'm not sure you're listening to me because half my audience is in the US. And they said, no. Anyway, I kept on searching and eventually came across a publisher through North America who went, that is great. We can do that. We can work with your Australian audience as well, and gave me very deep directive editorial feedback about the kinds of stories to put in the book to make sure that we covered all the geographic bases of our database. Yep. So, do you have a North American story? Do you have an Indian story? Do you have a story for people in Europe? And they've been amazing in the process of bringing this together.
So we've unpacked how you got started. We looked at the content you created and that journey that continues today. We touched on, but I might go back to the earned media side, where you've earned the right for someone to interview you on their podcast. Have you got any other? And you've done that. Is that a system you're doing now? Are you proactively reaching out? Have you got an agency to reach out on your behalf to go to other? To other podcasts, because it is a very powerful way to get your name out there, but it can be very time consuming.
It's very time consuming if you choose to do it yourself, which we did initially. And again, a primary screen a podcast host will use is, are they pitching themselves, or have they got a publicity company or an interview company booking them? They will put those people at the top of the queue because they know people are more serious. So I've been using a booking agency out of North America since 2019, and they've been fantastic. Again, because that's where half my listeners are, I want to make sure that I've got somebody on that time zone. It also means I have to get up at odd hours of the morning to meet the host's timeline, but the hosts, I always, if I get the opportunity in the thank you note I send to them, it's like, what was your experience with my agency? And they always consistently say professional. I can always count on them to pitch the right kind of people to me. And so for me, that's set and forget. They book 2 interviews per month in, month out. Yep. That doesn't mean that's when I do it, but that's my always on channel. I've picked up significant work from North America, from Europe, from the UK as a result of appearing on other people's podcasts. But it's a slow burn. One I remember, I got interviewed on a podcast, and somebody put me in the back of their mind. They kind of mentally put me aside for a budget for an event. Then they started listening to my podcast. Then they bought my book. And by the time we were ready to have a conversation, it wasn't a question of should we, it's how much and are you available? And they're the kind of phone calls we all love to take. But from the time they listened to the interview to the time they were ready to buy, that was 14 months. So that's why I say it's a long, slow burn. But that was a wonderful client. Is still working with them in North America, and they have been wonderful referrers of work for me to their clients in North America as well.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff. This is a drum that I beat all the time, is that how, particularly in areas where you're bringing on experts and professional services, I guess, and advisory and all of that sort of stuff, whether it's through speaking or coaching or mentoring or any or all of the above. Sometimes the gestation period of making that happen can be a long time, and it's the buyer's journey is quite zigzaggy, and so that just illustrates that. Thank you for sharing that, Oscar. That's a really good yarn. And I guess the other thing there, the message there is that it's a strategy to be on other people's podcasts. Can I ask the name of the agency that you use?
Yeah, Interview Connections. They're out of Rhode Island on the east coast of the United States. And Jessica and Margie, that's a good example because they had a podcast. I got to learn who they were and what they stood for well before I wanted to go and buy from them. And a year ago, as an example, I knew I'd need a book publicist in the United States. So I subscribed to 3 newsletters. Only one of them had a podcast. I subscribed to that as well. And it won't be any surprise to you, Trevor, that because of their podcast, I got to listen to the clients they work with, but they also interview their staff on that podcast as well. And I think for companies, they don't really understand the power of the stories their staff can tell about the brand and what the brand stands for. And to be honest, as important as it was listening to other authors, I was kind of listening to the book publicity people, the people who were calling up the media organisations day in and day out and listening to their stories. And I'm going to be very specific about the consultant I want working on my account as well. It won't just be the organisation. I want that person working on my law.
And they'd have lots of war stories too, being on the front line of pitching. But I'll just finish up that bit on the using an agency. It's a collaborative effort. You've got to do your homework and get do a good job on the podcast and understand the podcast you're going to be on, and they need to pitch you to the right places because I've got a podcast. I get pitched all the time, and often many times the pitch is a bit off base. But when it's a good one, you see it. So it's very much you pick the right person to pitch on your behalf. They're doing it on your behalf. It's your brand, and very, very important. But that's a terrific example of, again, extending the reach of your voice. So we've enhanced the credibility of our voice. We've extended the reach. Now let's just finish off by moving into extract the value from the profile and the reputation that you have been doing. So unbeknownst to you, you've been following this method that I've created all the way, which is terrific. So that's what I want to talk to you about. But it's so how do how many sort of streams of income do you make now off the back of your, could I call it a personal brand-based business?
There's the one-on-one coaching work that I do. There's speaking work. There's workshop work. And then there's the authoring, like the revenues that I earn through either bulk book sales as part of a corporate presentation or just wholesale book sales there. And roughly, if you were to look at it, it's about a third from one-on-one coaching with executives who either send me recordings of a team meeting where they hosted it and I'm auditing their listening. Then we'll work in that into their one-on-one coaching program. Or they bring me into workshops and go, okay, we want you to run a workshop and teach our leadership team how to listen to each other, how to listen to the broader organisation. And then just company kickoffs, sales kickoffs are typically the most frequent way that people will book me for the speaking events, and they've all been virtual for the last 2 years, and more importantly exporting overseas, which has been interesting. This year is the first year where I'll go 50% of my revenue is from overseas compared to domestic.
Fantastic. And you've got the shop on your website as well where you sell other things. Is that just sort of tickles along the merchandise side of things, if I can call it?
Yeah, it's not something I put an enormous amount of effort into. Sometimes I think it's more work than it's worth. I'd love to outsource the book sales and the card sales, which is where that's at. But it's kind of I always go, is that covering the overheads of my website, because as you know, Trevor, there's so many plugins and bits of software and feeding and watering and weeding you have to do of your own website. So that's I kind of look at that and go, okay, can that cover the cost of the people who are looking after my website?
So what sort of team have you got? Because, you know, you are the front person and you're doing work, but you've got, so let's put it that way. You've got the people doing the agents, the podcast interview agency who's getting you interviews on other people's podcasts 2 a month consistently. Have you got other help?
I've got a sound engineer who works on the deep listening podcast because we put a lot of work into post-production there. We've got somebody who looks after our website. That is a contract relationship there. And we have somebody who looks after the quiz for us as well. That's a third-party organisation. That's all they do is quizzes and assessments, and they do just a fantastic job. Evaluation Solutions to Melissa and Barry. They're really world class at what they do, and do a lot of work for people like me and advisory work. So they're the core, apart from, you know, making sure the invoicing and scheduling gets done for my calendar, and scheduling of newsletters and making sure the content goes out on a consistent time frame as well.
Yeah, terrific. Oh, mate, that's fantastic. I was wanting to make sure that we got through this and I didn't take you off onto too many tangents, because I wanted this sort of this joining of the dots, this linear story, which has been terrific. And I don't think I want you to order me, but I will just try and tie it all up in a bow at the end. But so what we heard was, you know, you came out of big corporate. You took the chance of on a new category, let's say. I'd say you are one of the world's leaders now in listening. It's a 10-year journey. You've done all the things about finding your voice through content, LinkedIn, Twitter. The podcast is your main owned media channel. The support of that is the newsletter. You do the monthly webinars for free. Are they archived, by the way, the webinars? Yep. So that's a mountain of content there. You've been collating questions and themes and from feedback from people in the who come to your webinars, plus also other people who you talk to on the podcasts. So you're getting feedback all the time. You're feeding that back into more content. They've got the newsletter going out. And you've built an enterprise around all that in terms of the types of services that a portfolio approach, I suppose, the types of services that you do offer people, and you're global, baby. You're global.
Trevor, so, I think just before the Christmas vacation, it was December 19, I got a phone call from the editor of the Financial Review, and for those of you who might not be in Australia, that's the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal in Australia. And they said, I can't believe that you exist. We've just done a piece of CEO research, and the second thing they're talking about is how do they improve their listening. And we couldn't find anybody but on the second page of Google. So keep this in mind, because people say if you're on page 2, you don't count. If the person is motivated, they just went, we thought we found a gold mine when we found you, Oscar, because all those interviews you've done, we know what you're talking about. And we did a 5-minute interview, which ended up in the Financial Review for their summer series, which had amazing longevity. And I picked up a lot of work out of that as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. I actually meant to ask you that before. Do you get much other media interest as a result of people finding you? That's a classic example, by the way, that's of how that can happen.
Typically, it's other podcast hosts who are asking me, and occasionally there are bloggers who blog in the category of speaking, and they go, I just want a different take for my customers. Would you mind doing a guest blog post on listening the other side of speaking. And I probably get one of those a quarter. And if it's right, in some cases it has been, in some cases it hasn't, we'll do something reciprocal with that person as well. So we may interview them, or we may get them to do a guest post in our newsletter, as an example.
Yeah, fantastic. And just going back to the financial review one, I've often said that, there's two ways to get media coverage. One is you pitch out, which you're you can say you're doing that often with the podcasting, but it's media generally as well. And a lot of people get to that, but there's a push and a pull today. And you're, pulling people into you because they'll find you if they're looking for that particular topic, which is good, and you get found. There's that side of things. But more importantly, whether you're pitching or whether they find you or they hear you word of mouth or whatever, they're going to check you out. And will they be validated in their mind that you are actually the expert and you have the chops and you know what you're talking about? And that is a classic example with the Financial Review in Australia, where they did their homework, they've worked out, yes, you know what you're talking about because the proof points are out there, everything's out there. And that gave them the confidence, and they weren't then going to talk to anyone else. So just fantastic. Lessons abound, Oscar. So when's the new book come out? You can for pre-order now.
Yeah.
What's the name of it?
Yeah.
So people can find it. It was an easy
How
one.
to listen.
How to listen.
Mate.
I always remember this story between David Meerman Scott, who wrote one of the Bibles in content marketing called The New Rules of Marketing and PR, and kind of like about 2007, and I think he's rewritten it about 8 times now. And there's another guy called Mitch Joel, a very well-known podcaster, and his podcast and his book was 6 Pixels of Separation. And I remember them talking with each other and about book titles, and Mitch was saying, "Oh, I wish I just did the one that said what was on the tin." Like it was. I think you can get too cute, and I love 6 Pixels of Separation as a title, but you can get a bit cute with titles sometimes, and sometimes what you see on the tin is what's in the tin.
And that was all because we listened to our Deep Listening Ambassadors community. We tested the title with the community. We also tested the title with people who don't know us. And we tested the title with Google and Amazon AdWords as well. So we had to triangulate 4 different input methods to make sure the title get us there, because the publisher has said that 80% of book sales are going to be sourced from a Google search. So we just wanted to make it as frictionless as possible for them to buy that or find that and then make a decision.
It's surprising you got it. Like it's there for the taking, and of course how to listen for accountants, how to listen for lawyers, for doctors. That'd be a good one. Excellent. All right, so that'll be out soon, and probably by the time the podcast is, it'll be out. But certainly people can pre-order that through all the various and myriad channels that are out there. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with us, Oscar. And if people go to Oscar Trimboli, they can find you.
Yeah, there's only one.
There's only one. Excellent. Thanks for that. And good luck with the new book.
Thanks for listening, Trevor.
Thank you.
The reputation economy is here. The world today needs more genuine, credible experts and leaders to stand up and share their experience, their wisdom, their stories and ideas. Are you in?